There is no music on the page. That may sound like a strange thing to say, especially from someone who spends a great deal of time with old scores, old books, old parts, and the dusty remains of musical life. But I think it is true. There are notes on the page, there are rhythms, there are clefs, key signatures, bar lines, articulations, dynamics, tempo markings, slurs, accents, rehearsal letters, breath marks, bowings, fingerings, and occasionally an Italian instruction that has caused mild panic in rehearsal rooms for 200 years. But music? Music is not ink. Music is not paper, and music is definitely not a PDF. The page contains the grammar of music. It preserves signs. It preserves instructions. It gives us a structure through which a musical thought may be recovered. But grammar is not speech. A dictionary is not a conversation. A recipe is not a meal. A map is not a journey. And a score is not music. This is the Musical Archeologist, forgotten ideas from music's past. I'm Craig Dabelstein. Today we return to Oscar Comettant's 1874 book, Francis Planté, Portrait musical à la plume, his musical portrait of the French pianist Francis Planté. Comettant was writing about a pianist, but the idea we are looking at today reaches far beyond the piano. It reaches every performer and every conductor. In Comettant's book, there is a fascinating passage in which he defends Planté against a criticism that now sounds almost comic. Someone had accused Planté of being only a virtuoso and not a composer. To understand that criticism, we need to remember the world Planté inhabited. The 19th century was the great age of the composer-pianist. Liszt was not only a thunderbolt at the keyboard, but a composer of symphonic poems, piano works, transcriptions, sacred music, and much else. Chopin's entire artistic identity was bound to the piano, but he was also one of the great composers of the century. Thalberg, Hummel, Rubinstein, Gottschalk, and many others stood before the public not merely as performers, but as creators of the very music they played. So, in that world, to be a great pianist who did not chiefly appear as a composer could seem, to some people, like a kind of incompleteness. Only a virtuoso, only a performer. Only the person who takes the silent works of Bach, Handel, Rameau, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Weber, Chopin, and Liszt and makes them audible again. Comettant is not impressed by this criticism. He argues that the performer who does not compose is not necessarily a lesser artist. Such a performer may be more free to serve the whole world of music. The composer-performer is often absorbed in his own works, his own style, his own school. But the interpreter may devote himself, fingers and soul, to all composers and all schools whose works deserve to be heard. And then Comettant says something profound. Without these performers, the works of the masters would die, so to speak, with them. That phrase is the heart of this episode. Music can die while the page survives. It can sit on a shelf. It can be catalogued, archived, scanned, digitised, indexed, and preserved in climate-controlled respectability. And still be dead. Because preservation is not the same as life. A preserved score is not yet a living musical act. It is a possibility, a set of clues, a body waiting for breath. Dr David Whitwell, conductor, musicologist, and one of the most passionate advocates for the living nature of music, says, "Music is a verb." That is a small sentence, but it contains an entire philosophy. Music is not merely an object. It is not simply a thing that sits on a shelf or lies printed on a page or waits patiently in a catalogue. Music is something done. It happens. It moves through time. It requires breath, gesture, intention, risk, and human presence. A score may preserve the grammar, but only performance restores the action. This is where the interpreter enters. The performer looks at the page and says, "This was once sound. This was once breath, gesture, tension, release, wit, grief, dance, prayer, ceremony, theatre, argument, and memory. This mattered to someone, and it may matter again." The performer's task is not merely to obey the page, it is to understand what the page is trying to preserve. That is why the old idea of interpretation is so important. Today, we sometimes speak as if interpretation means personal freedom. That is my interpretation, we say, when we mean, I have chosen to do it this way. But interpretation, in the deeper sense, is not self-expression imposed upon the work. It is advocacy. An advocate does not invent the case. An advocate studies it, understands it, orders it, brings out its strongest truths, speaks on behalf of someone who is absent. That is what a performer does for a composer. And it is what a conductor does, perhaps most strangely of all. Because the conductor, unlike the pianist, the singer, the violinist, the clarinetist, or the trumpet player, produces no sound directly. The conductor's instrument is other people. That is both the beauty and the terror of the job. A conductor cannot simply press a key and hear the result. A conductor cannot blow into the instrument. A conductor cannot bow the string. A conductor must form a musical conviction so clear and so communicable that other musicians begin to breathe it, phrase it, shape it, and believe it. The conductor stands before the score, but the score is not enough. The score may say forte. But what kind of forte? Triumphant? Brutal? Radiant? Desperate? Ceremonial? Hollow? The score may say adagio. But what kind of slowness? Stillness? Exhaustion? Prayer? Suspense? Tenderness? Grief? The grammar is on the page. The music is in the meaning. And the meaning has to be found, imagined, argued for, and finally embodied in sound. That does not mean ignoring the composer. Quite the opposite. The page matters deeply. The page is our evidence. It is our contract with the composer. It is the place where the musical thought has left its most durable trace. But a trace is not the living thing. The interpreter must therefore be both obedient and imaginative, humble and courageous, faithful and alive. Too much obedience and the music becomes a corpse dressed correctly. Too much ego and the composer disappears under the interpreter's perfume. The art lies somewhere between. This is why Comettant's defence of the performer still matters. He reminds us that performance is not secondary to music history. It is music history becoming audible. The scholar can identify the piece. The editor can prepare the text. The publisher can print the score. The archivist can preserve the parts. All of that is essential. But until someone plays, the music remains in waiting. The interpreter is a servant of the dead. You've been listening to The Musical Archeologist, Forgotten Ideas from Music's Past. Written and presented by me, Craig Dabelstein. The music for this podcast was composed by Jeffrey Young. The Musical Archeologist is one of many projects from Maxime's Music, dedicated to recovering forgotten music, forgotten writings, and forgotten musical worlds. Thank you for listening.